Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 40 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, in which the Sharks have won 6-2, or maybe more specifically, Timo Meyer has won 6-2, as he has an absolutely historic night for the first time in San Jose Sharks history, the first time in 31 years of this franchise being in the NHL. A Sharks player has managed to score 5 goals in a single game, and Meyer even did that in just the first 2 periods of this one. The Sharks have had multiple 4-goal games from players. Most recently, it was Evander Kane against the Calgary Flames a few years ago. And of course, we all remember the classic 4-goal game from Tomas Hertl in just his 3rd career game. But here tonight, Meyer is the man of the afternoon, I guess you could say, by getting those 5 goals. An absolute monster performance from Timo Meyer in general. However, if we actually look at this game as a whole, the Sharks didn't necessarily play all that well if you remove Timo Meyer's performance in this one. In fact, the Sharks kind of found themselves defending for a lot of this game. I would say for a good 45 minutes to maybe even 50 minutes of this game, the Kings were the better team, getting a lot of zone time, a lot of good opportunities, and yet the Sharks, because of Timo Meyer's historic and heroic performance, managed to get the win anyway. But you could actually view this game as a bit of a karmic moment, as it was in the 2 previous ones against the Rangers and the Pittsburgh Penguins, where the Sharks looked, by all accounts, the better team against both of those strong Eastern Conference opponents, and yet would end up losing both of those games 3-0 and then 2-1 in overtime. So here tonight, they didn't look as good as they did in the 2 previous ones, but what goes around comes around sometimes in the NHL world, and the Sharks managed to get the 2 points, and this is an even more important 2 points, because while the previous ones were against Eastern Conference opponents that don't really matter in any sort of playoff race, here tonight was a 4-point game against a Los Angeles Kings team who the Sharks will be fighting with for a playoff spot come near the end of the season. So you definitely wanted to win this one, and that's exactly what the Sharks and Timo Meyer did. As we move on into the goal scoring, like I said, Meyer with 5 goals, so you'll hear his name a lot. This one starts off with a Timo Meyer power play goal. Nice to see the Sharks power play contribute not 1 but 2 goals here tonight. They definitely looked better after they'd been struggling for a while. Rudolph Balcers would then get one as he'd make it 2-0. Nice little keep in at the blue line by Tomas Hertl. But besides that one Balcers goal, it was all Timo Meyer. He'd get the 3rd goal of this game and then the 4th goal to get a hat trick just in the first period, and it would be 4-0 San Jose with about a minute to go. The Kings would actually get one back to make it 4-1 and give the Sharks some doubt heading into the first intermission. And this actually reminded me of a game many moons ago, back in 2011, the playoffs between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, a series that featured the famous now Joe Thornton slide in Game 6 as he scored the overtime goal. But it was in Game 3 in which it was the Los Angeles Kings who would take a 4-0 lead in the first period in that one. And while it wasn't late in the first where the Sharks would get their first goal, and it would actually be early in the second, that would be a game in which the Kings had been leading 4-0 and would end up losing 6-5 in overtime. So that was something that crossed my mind when Kopitar scored this goal. But the Sharks, credit to them, they didn't allow the Kings back into this one. They'd scored the next 2 goals and the only 2 goals of the second period. Timo Meyer with both of them, of course. He'd get his 19th and 20th of the year, as with these goals, he has shot up now to 7th place in the league in terms of points, which is immensely impressive with some of the fantastic talent around the league like McDavid and Draisaitl and Kaprizov and Ovechkin and Huberdeau and all these players. And so the Sharks were leading 6-1 after 2. In the third period, the Kings would actually make it somewhat interesting as Anderson would score to make it 6-2, and there was a lot of push from the Kings, but the Sharks defended well enough at the very least and got some very solid goaltending, and so they'd close out the game 6-2. On to the players to talk about on the first line. I mean, I've already mentioned a lot about Timo Meyer, but I guess to talk about him a bit more, he's just been so dominant over these past few games, and honestly, I say over these past few games, but it's realistically been over this entire season. Timo Meyer has been the one major constant for the San Jose Sharks. I cannot think of a single player on this team who has been anywhere near as consistent as Timo Meyer. Hertl has been a lot better as of late, but he didn't have the best start to the season. Logan Couture had a great start to the season, and he's been pretty solid as of late, but nowhere near that same level as he was earlier. Erik Carlson has looked very strong over these past few games, but earlier on in the year didn't look that great. Brent Burns has been very up and down. James Reimer had started the season off, and he's probably the closest one to Timo Meyer. James Reimer started the season off very well, but of course, as we know, prior to him sort of getting down with a bit of an injury as of late and having Adin Hill start a few games, Reimer was struggling over the 3 or 4, 5 starts that he did have. But Timo Meyer, it feels as though every game he seems to show up, play fantastic, and he's rewarded with the 5-goal performance here tonight. When it comes to Hertl and then Balcers, I've mentioned Balcers in these past couple of games has been much more of a passenger to the Tomas Hertl and Timo Meyer show, but I did definitely enjoy his performance in tonight's game, much more so than in the previous two. Rudolf Balcers finally felt like a real part of this trio of players, so that was definitely nice to see. Made a couple of nice plays, got a goal here tonight for the second straight game, as well as even had a couple of great chances to score another 1 or 2 in this game. In fact, basically, this was the only line for the San Jose Sharks that was getting any consistent amount of offensive zone time and chances. When this line came on, you could expect the Sharks to look good, and if you only watched shifts of this line this game, you would say, wow, the Sharks were very competitive in this one. It's really when you start to watch those other 3 lines for the Sharks that you say, okay, yeah, the Kings clearly were quite dominant. As we move on to the second line, Couture, Dahlin, and Gregor, this was the only line that was at least somewhat okay as well. I wouldn't say that they were anywhere near the performance of the first line, but there were some decent chances. Gregor, as usual, getting some chances, but is never going to actually score a goal. Dahlin looked okay-ish, though not anything super impressive, and Couture also looked pretty solid. It wasn't a fantastic offensive game for this particular line, but it was still okay enough, I would say. Where things start to get a bit ugly here is in the bottom 6, as you would expect for a game in which the Sharks were pretty much dominated besides with their first line on the ice. These bottom 6 players clearly struggled here. There were some decent chances, I will say, in particular for this third line. I thought Cogliano had a couple set up by some decent speed from Matt Nieto, which is something that we have been seeing over these past few games, but as a general rule here tonight, this third line kind of found themselves defending a lot in their own zone, and while they did an okay job of that, to say the least, since the Sharks did only let in 2 goals now for the 6th straight game on a manned net, which is still very impressive in its own right, they obviously would have liked to spend more time in the offensive zone. When it comes to the fourth line of Weatherby, Viel, and Peterson, Peterson returns to the lineup. I don't know what Peterson did to deserve to continuously get a spot in the lineup. He's had 1, maybe 2 good games in this entire year, and that's not 2 good games in 5 games played, or even 10 games played, or even 15 games played. Peterson has played over 20 games thus far this season, and he continues to earn a lineup spot doing essentially nothing. This is like that one person in your group projects at school who does absolutely zero work and then still gets to benefit from the fact that the team is getting a B+ or an A- or something like that. Peterson consistently steals lineup spots here. The same, I would say, would go for Jasper Weatherby, which is surprising to me because we know the history that Bob Booner has with rookies. He's usually quite punishing of those players if they're not doing a lot of great things for a specific team. He'll give them a couple games and he'll say, oh, this player hasn't adapted to the rigorous grind of an NHL schedule, and so he'll bench them for a bit. He'll healthy scratch them. But Weatherby has played a good chunk of games this season and really hasn't done much of anything with that opportunity. Not that the Sharks necessarily have such fantastic other choices to play over these 2 specific players, but still, I will mention that. When it comes to VL, he got into a fight in this game. it was actually a pretty exciting fight. This was let to go on for a while by the linesman. Usually you see the linesman step in within a few seconds, and so a fight kind of doesn't really get to evolve into anything. But Viel and Lemieux were actually given a pretty decent amount of time to go at it. Pretty even fight, I would say. Viel got some good punches in. Maybe it was leaning slightly more towards Lemieux, but, Viel did what he did, and I assume he's going to keep a spot in the lineup anyway. When it comes to the defensive side of things, Brent Burns and Erik Carlson both had decent offensive games, but also found themselves hemmed in, as you would expect in this game, as the two best Sharks defensemen, or at least the two Sharks defensemen who get the most ice time. If the team as a whole is getting pushed in, you can expect that those two players are a part of that, and a big part of that. Erik Carlson is just, it's funny for me to watch him sometimes. I mean, I've probably said this in the past, but I will say it once again here tonight. It's crazy how you can sometimes get a completely different Erik Carlson, even on the same exact shift. There are times where he's going to be very active defensively. He's going to rush into the corner. He's going to fight for pucks along the boards and attempt to really hard work this puck out of the zone. And then there are times where he kind of just parks himself in front of whichever goaltender is starting the game for the San Jose Sharks and just sort of sits there and hopes the puck eventually comes to his stick and he can pass it out or break it out himself. It's kind of weird in that case. There was actually a shift in particular this game where I noticed this, where he's standing in front of the net, not doing essentially anything, and then eventually he decides, okay, now let's actually go after the puck along the corner, in the wall, along the boards. It was just sort of a strange situation, but not really a huge criticism of Erik Carlson. It's just an oddity that I have noticed. When it comes to the third pairing, probably the one that I want to talk about the most, and it would actually have to do with Ryan Merkley, who took a bit of a step back here tonight, though I'm not entirely sure how much of that was his fault, because Ryan Merkley was thrust into a much larger role here tonight because the Sharks had such a massive lead in this game, 6-1 early on in this third period. It seems as though that Bob Booner really wanted to test what Ryan Merkley could do when protecting a lead, when having to play this type of defensive role, and I don't necessarily think that Ryan Merkley was super up to that particular challenge. I don't think it was an awful game from Merkley. Clearly, the Sharks were not necessarily bleeding when he was on the ice, but he had a boost of ice time of about 4 minutes from his usual over these past few games. Ever since he's gotten called back up near the beginning of January, his highest ice time prior to this game had been 15 and a half minutes. Here tonight, he got over 19 minutes, so clearly he was given a lot of responsibility, and I don't think he necessarily lived up to that. I will say, however, that that's really not the worst thing in the world. Reminder that Merkley has only played about a dozen games in the NHL at this point, so you're not expecting him to be some perfect shutdown defenseman who's easily going to be able to carry a team's load defensively in a game where clearly the Sharks are not pushing a ton offensively and haven't really been rolling offensively besides that first line. So all things considered, while Merkley didn't look great here tonight, I don't think it's enough, and I feel as though he has enough stock built up over these past few games prior to this one to still maintain a spot in the lineup. And finally, when it comes to James Reimer, he manages to get back between the pipes here tonight after Adin Hill had stringed together a few very impressive performances. Reimer gets the start here, kind of back from injury, whatever is doing with Reimer. He's had 2 of these kind of strange injuries thus far this season. And Reimer, prior to that injury, had not looked particularly good, so he does have a very nice bounce back game here tonight. There was that goal on Kopitar. That was one that Reimer definitely would have liked to have back, and it kind of worried me a bit. But besides that Kopitar goal, he had no chance on the Anderson one, and he made a ton of great saves here tonight, so there cannot be any complaints for him. It's nice to see that this original plan that the Sharks had coming into this season to have 2 solid starters at the very least seems to be looking okay at this point because of the bounce back that Adin Hill has had over his past few starts, and now this bounce back performance from Reimer here tonight, or this afternoon. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on the Seattle Kraken for the second time this season and the second time in franchise history. The first game against the Kraken, who by the way are one of the worst teams in the league thus far this season, did not go the way of the San Jose Sharks, so the Sharks will be looking to get their franchise first ever victory over Seattle, just as they got their franchise first ever 5-goal game here tonight. One thing will likely end up being a bit easier than the other. Class dismissed.